All right, welcome everybody. I think we still have a handful, maybe three or four more people who are going to join us in a bit. But in the meantime, welcome to the salon with me and Eliot, where we will be discussing cities and sci-fi and the future of cities. Eliot and I were just talking about like writing and Twitter and essays and what different mediums afford us, and the pros and cons of trying to convey ideas in different lengths, different contexts, mediums. Anyway, I think I just want to do some quick like overview of what I think this is going to be like. So we have like 2.5 hours. I have a list of questions that people sent us before the salon, but like not everyone from that salon, not everyone who asked those questions is in the salon. So what I think we'll do is, so those questions are like backup, like if we run out of things to talk about, which I don't think will be the case, but just in case. So I think we'll start with like, I'll ask Eliot some stuff that I'm curious about, and then we'll like roughly like the second half-ish, we will, and I encourage everyone to like be lively in the chat and like ask questions, and I will be like your spokesperson and relay questions over to Eliot for like the first 45 minutes ish. And then from there, I think we can like expand and be more organic and just ask people to ask questions and so on. Does that sound good? Eliot, how do you feel? Or do you have something in mind?
Sounds great to me. Yeah, no, lead the way. I'm along for the ride.
Excellent. So Eliot, funny thing is like when Anna asked me if I would want to do the salon, like the phrases that got me were victory condition as the title of the essay, which I'm guessing is a civilization reference, I'm guessing. And then
Yes.
within the essay itself, you mentioned SimCity. And those are
Mhm.
both games. So I was much more of a SimCity player, and I got to Civilization later on.
Mhm.
And I
Mhm.
wonder how many people in the chat, in the call, also joined like out of like, it's a fellow SimCity enjoyer. Right. So can you tell us like your backstory with those games, or how you felt about it? Or
Yeah, absolutely. Actually for me, the primary one, especially for that short story, Victory Condition, is SimCity. So what that short story actually took me by surprise. I last summer, so about a year ago, an editor from Anthropocene magazine reached out and asked if I'd contribute a story to their sort of collection that's about the future of climate. And I've written sci-fi novels that play with that theme. And so I wanted, and so initially I said no, because I was like, I've sort of already explored that in fiction. And then I couldn't get this idea out of my head, which is, I played so much SimCity 2000 specifically, rather than like the original SimCity. And I always loved, like, whether through honest struggle or through cheat codes, getting to build the arcologies, which are like when as you sort of level up through the game and you finally get to that point. And it always just seemed like such a fun thought experiment that you could basically contain a city in a building, right? That almost everything that you could need could be that centralized. And one thing, I live in the San Francisco Bay Area. I live in Oakland, and one thing that is like very locally specific that's been going on here is that there's been a lot of issues with housing over the past 20 years in the San Francisco Bay Area. Basically, like, we haven't built enough housing for all the new people that have moved here to work new jobs and stuff like that. And so it's a big local political issue. And one of the things that's been happening very recently is we're trying to get new housing built, and so you're having these neighborhoods that are becoming denser than they've been for many decades. And I wanted to play that out, like, in my head. I wanted to play out, like, what is the most extreme example of that, right? Like, if we create the most dense city possible, it's one of those arcologies, right? It's like the entire city in one building. And so that's what harkened back to SimCity for me. And I think that another really important aspect of SimCity, and I would hope that for anyone else who shares my nostalgia for that game on this call, another thing that, like, I love about SimCity as a game is that it because you get to it's a simulator. It's like a flight simulator, but for building cities. And because of that, you get to play with any possibility, right? You can, like, do your zoning differently. You can like you just play again and like start again, and you get to play over and over and over and over again. And so what that sort of gives you emotionally is this feeling that the world is malleable, that it is really dense with possibility, and that feeling felt so lacking in the conversations around the actual city I live in, where whenever people had ideas for how you could make things better, almost always the pop cultural response was almost like, here are the reasons why that won't work, right? And that emotional place of like when you're with a friend, and you know how sometimes you have an idea and ideas are fragile. And so when you bring it up with a friend for the first time, sometimes people will just start pointing out where it's wrong or the things you're missing. And then sometimes people will be like, oh yeah, sure, of course that has some issues, but also this, also that. And then you start building on each other's ideas. And I feel like that was for me, that emotional place that SimCity put me in, that you actually could like make your built environment better, that you could actually like change the place in which you live, and like that was a promise that I wanted to try to play with in fiction, just because it's a good sandbox for it.
Nice. Yeah, I definitely like, so as you were saying it, I was like, oh yeah, that's so true. Like I've also had that sense of just playing the game and starting over and over and seeing all the different ways you could do things. Like, yeah, you get the sense that the world is malleable. And you don't realize the degree to which different people have different beliefs on that until you try to do stuff, or you're just saying stuff that comes naturally to you based on your beliefs. And then other people just respond differently. And you're like, oh, you don't realize that the world is malleable? Right. I actually have like, yeah, I have like a personal curious question of like, so this kind of, I guess, goes backwards or upwards, but like, how did you get into novels and writing fiction and all of that?
Oh yeah. So I've always been a huge reader. So ever since I was a little kid, like here's a sort of funny story. I went to this weird elementary school where one of the classes we had was handwork, where you learn to like sew and knit and like stuff like that. And the teacher would read like myths, like story, like stories, folklore stories to the class as the class was like crocheting something or whatever. And so you'd have projects, like all the little kids would have projects. And so like you might make a stuffed animal or like things like that. And my projects, my little stuffed animals or whatever we were making, were always approximately 10% the size of every other student. Like I made no progress at all making these like knitting projects or whatever, because I was so absorbed in the teacher's story that she was telling us that like I totally lost myself in it and my hands would just stop, right? So I basically like like I don't think it was a class you could fail as like a first grader, but I came as close as you possibly could because I was so absorbed in those stories. And so for me, that's always been just a really like story is such a powerful avenue for exploring the world and connecting with other people's art. And so I've always been a huge reader, but I didn't really I didn't dream of becoming a writer. I just loved books and loved storytelling. And so I actually like went to college for like international affairs, like international relations, and then I started working in tech startups. So, and that was just fun. I was like having fun building things with friends, right? And it felt very hands-on, and you're sort of with a small group of people who are really excited about stuff. And so that's how my sort of like early professional life was, about building things with friends. And I worked in a couple different startups. I worked in a VC firm. And along the way, I was sort of like, when I read, like there are so many business books out there, right? Like like far more than you could ever or should want to read. And I was curious, so I wanted to learn about this new world I was exploring, and so I would read a lot. And I sort of quickly came to a point where I was like, okay, a lot of these business books, they may have like really useful principles in them, right? Like and like and they have fun anecdotes that might reference companies you've heard of or whatever. But it was really difficult to find any stories that spoke to the lived experience of being in like a small group of people really trying to make something, because there's so much on the line, right? There's so much at stake when it's your own project, and so it feels really high stakes, and like you'd have friendships forged and broken, like it really impacts how people live. And so to me, I was like, man, I want to read a really good novel that invites the reader into this kind of a journey. And I couldn't find that novel to read. I actually like very diligently searched just to try to find it at the library or on Amazon or whatever, to try to say like, okay, cool, like I just want my fix for this. And I couldn't find it. And so eventually I decided, well, if I want to read this book, and like I have, like maybe I should try writing it. And so I just opened up like a text editor and started typing. And that book, my first book is basically like a thriller about two college students who drop out to start a startup, and they get caught up in this whole money laundering scene. It's actually interesting now because it's now with machine learning and AI really like taking off in popular culture. My first novel, which came out in 2014 or something, was about applying machine learning to financial fraud. And so so that book became a trilogy, and then I just kept writing because I kept having fun, and I kept having ideas for things for stories that I wanted to exist in the world that didn't exist yet. So I was like, well, I have to do it. So yeah, that's how I got into writing. So it was very accidental, but obviously looking back, you can draw your own narrative through it.
Nice. Yeah, that's very interesting. It's such a it's striking to me. Just I'm nerding out about how striking it is that it really is the stories that we write that are like we just need it to exist ourselves, or like we just like because I get like young authors in my DMs all the time, or like would-be authors, and they're always asking things like, oh, what should my plan be, like what kind of target market should I have? And I'm like, no, it's like that's very if you are not like the crazy fan of your own book that you want, like it's very hard to persuade anybody else, especially even if people want to read it and but just overwhelmed.
Yeah, just write the book you want to read. And like I feel like that sort of applies to like you could apply that to almost any path you want to take in life, right? Like write the song you want to listen to, make the tool you want to use, like whatever it is. Like it's such a like, it's not that you can't do other things. There are writers who write to market, right? And like, so there's no wrong way to go about it. But I do think that for when you're not trying to make something that you yourself are sort of almost the first audience for, then you invite a lot of additional work and sort of strife into your life as a creator, because you aren't the person, right? So now you're trying to now you just have all that uncertainty that you're always trying to manage, and that never goes away, right? I mean, I also get it. I don't think I never would have become a novelist if it weren't for the internet. Like there are very real, at least in the US book publishing market, like there are I have had countless novels declined by publishers because they don't fit like the length expectations for how they see genre. And I'm like, I could not care less about, like, don't even talk to me about that, right? Like, I want to make a story that I'm really proud of, that I can share with people I care about. And so the internet has always made it so that I always have a path and it works. And like, it just seems so silly to me. But I mean, there are, I feel like, especially for aspiring writers who haven't sort of like taken that leap yet, it can be really intimidating because you look at the internet and people give you all this advice about basically writing to market. And I don't know, like it can easily lead you down a rabbit hole that is sort of self-defeating. Yeah.
Yeah, I totally agree. All right, so we should probably get to talking about cities at this point. Right? But it's fun backstory to get.
Yeah.
So I mean, we brought up SimCity earlier and
Mm.
possibilities and writing things like victory condition because of that sense of malleability. Um, I guess I'm trying to fish for like what else? Like what is the essence of why we care about cities? I guess, or like why do we? I mean, so I mean, I'm guessing
Mm.
everyone in this call lives in a city, right? So it's like for most modern people, it's probably, well, not most, we have to caveat a lot, right? But for a lot of people, you're kind of, it's not much of a choice. And every year there are like millions of people who choose to go from rural
Hmm.
areas to go to cities. But I'm trying to fish for the right question. Something like not why should we care about cities, but like um just what I guess the would you agree with the characterization that like the core thing about a city is density? Or how would you describe, like
Yeah,
if you
I
were to
mean,
describe what a city is?
yeah. So maybe I'll just like go off on a tangent
Yes,
relative, like, and like we'll try to invent this question together.
correct.
Uh, so I think that cities are really fascinating, and their role in culture has changed. So, like pre-industrial revolution, you sort of had cities, like so many humans worked in agriculture, that cities were always the center of like cultural evolution, in the sense that like that's where most of the people were, and even more than that, that's where most of the wealth was, right? So like even if you choose your favorite empire from at least 1,000 years ago, like that's where the sort of political elite lived, that's where the military elite lived and the intellectual elite lived, and like they would bring in surplus grain from agriculture, which is basically the entire economy of every empire, more or less, and that's what supported that sort of like cadre of people. So you just had higher density, so you had more ideas flowing there. But I think that like what's quite different today, that than if you go back in time to your favorite empire, is how dramatically humans are now centralized in cities, right? So like virtually no one works in agriculture anymore, like literally less than 2% of humans. And almost everyone else moves to the city. And as you said, like the sort of, if you read headlines about this, it's often about like disenfranchised people who used to be farmers moving to the city for opportunity. But like even in rich countries, that dynamic still exists. Like I actually remember I went to high school in Berkeley, California, which is like part of this big Bay Area ecosystem. So it's a big city. And I had a few friends who went to high school at like outlying basically suburbs, right? And they were always like, the kids in the rich suburbs were always the kids with the most problems, because there was not enough going on. And so they were the ones getting in really big trouble and like all this stuff. And they were always jealous of like of the access that you had to the big city. So I don't even think, like, obviously part of it is about economic opportunity, which is the big story when you read the news, right, about urbanization. But I think that the more important thing is that, like, in the modern world today, like, cities are where everything is happening, and we're social animals, so you want to be part of where everything is happening. And so there are these sort of vortexes for like human culture and ideas. Like if you want to know what's going to happen next, or if you want to help invent what's going to happen next, and whatever your sort of zone of endeavor is, like, basically it's happening in cities. And so I think that is why I think that, like, if I try to think about the next 100 years, the next 200 years, like, you're basically going to have a world where there are cities and everything else. And that has changed the politics of the US for sure. It's certainly changed like what life is like in California, in the state where I live, but it's true everywhere. And I think that there's a lot, like Singapore, where you're calling in from, and San Francisco have a hell of a lot more in common than if I drive half an hour east to a small town in the Central Valley and compare that to, like to San Francisco. Like Singapore and San Francisco have much, much more in common than that. So I think that's why cities are so important to try to understand, is because that's where humans are making the future happen.
Right. And I guess when you say that, the thing that clicks for me that's exciting is that, so there are all these cities all over the world. They're all like laboratories of humans figuring stuff out, trying new things. And it seems likely or plausible or likely that if there's any small thing that we can figure out that just makes the way cities run better, and even if it's, and that could be subjective in some ways to some people, whatever, but like, and I have friends who are in New York and in SF who are like thinking very hard about these things, like how do you just organize sub communities within cities to be more effective functional groups, like as friend groups and event spaces and all those things. And yeah, it seems plausible that figuring out so it's unlikely that we're done, right? Like, as a species, that like we figured out. Exactly. And so it's the ball is still rolling for us to like figure out better ways of being citizens of cities, and like just making them, and then like the transmission of information and knowledge is so fast that like a handful of people could figure something out in one city, and then like it could be replicated or attempted in many other cities like overnight, which is super exciting.
Yeah, I mean, okay, so right behind me, can you see this photo sort of on the wall?
You're kind of breaking up though.
It's a little too far away, but of the New Bay Bridge, which is like the biggest piece of local infrastructure they've built recently around here, and took a picture of it mid-construction. And this is, I'm sitting where I write, and I always love having that picture there, like in my writing space, because it's a reminder that like everything is a work in progress, right? And I think we're just at the beginning. What
you're breaking up a little bit.
These new mega cities. It's fine. Can you hear me?
So can you go back a bit? You're saying we're just at the beginning of. We're losing. Shahid, Ian, can you guys see Eliot? Fine. Nice. He's breaking up for everyone, right?
I can see you just fine.
Okay, keep talking. I think you're okay now.
Okay. Strange. Sorry about that. Yeah, no, just that like I love having that picture of the bridge there, because it's a reminder that everything is a work in progress. And I think that we're just at the beginning of trying to figure out what these new, like the biggest cities of the world, even just a few hundred years ago, were like the equivalent of like a bedroom community in many of today's cities, right? So like we're just figuring out what it means to have millions of people living in one place, and so I think that there's so much room for invention here. And I think that a lot of our conventions today will look sort of silly and antiquated like a few decades out, right? So I think that the experiments that your friends are running are really important, right? Like you don't ever know which of them are going to work. And I mean, in some ways, I think that like even this conversation, like Interintellect as an idea, is an experiment in sort of the shadow city that is the internet, where everybody has their sort of like second home, right? So yeah, I think that's super important.
In the chat, Arya asks, could we design cities to create more long-term scenes like many French salon-style locations? This is one of my long-term passions. And Eliot, I would love to hear what you think about just scenes in general and how we can we seed them? Can we encourage them to happen? Oh, it's frozen again.
Yeah, I mean,
okay.
I love that. I mean, like I love this is sort of like Brian Eno's idea of genius, right? That exactly. Sort of like the best ideas are these emergent phenomena. And I mean, I think that that's very clear if you look at it historically, right? Like if you look at Florence, if you look at Southern England in the Now you guys are breaking up for me. I seem to have full service. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I hear you. I mean, you were breaking up for a second there, but it's fine now.
Okay. Yeah, and I, like, I think that, like, the way that, okay, so I think that there are two ways of looking at this, like macro and micro. So macro is move to the place where people are doing the stuff you care about, right? I mean, like, this is obvious, but, like, I don't know, like, if you want to make movies, like, move to a place where people are making movies you think are amazing, right? If you're working in a specific area of science, like, where is the most interesting work happening? And usually it's pretty obvious. Like, it's not that's not a mystery most of the time, because if you care about some field, you're going to just know who the main players are and where are they based, right? So I think that that's a very important thing to pay attention to, macro. I think that micro, it's the way to plant seeds for this kind of stuff is it's almost like, I feel like the best, I think that the best way to illustrate what works is to look at what doesn't. So here's a great example of what doesn't work. A lot of, especially like national and regional governments, send officials to do tours of Silicon Valley in the hope that they can then build their own Silicon Valley. And almost always, the way in which they claim to be building their own Silicon Valley is by building a fancy office park, right? So they'll say, hey, welcome to this, Peru's Silicon Valley, or where, insert your country here. And it's it's shiny, it's new. They have a ribbon cutting ceremony with the mayor, and they make a bunch of announcements about how it's going to be a center for innovation, right? Like if you've ever been to Silicon Valley, and even if you haven't, I can tell you the built infrastructure is not what makes it special. Like, it's a bunch of boring office parks. Like, that's not why it is what it is. And so, and so sort of building shiny things is not the way to plant the seed that question refers to. I think that the best way to plant the seed that question refers to, and, like, I'm sure smart people would disagree, but from my perspective, the best seed is host a dinner with people you think are interesting, right? Like, literally start just bringing people together in whatever banal way you want to, and get like, just weave those connections more tightly together. And I think that it's not rocket science. I think it's very straightforward. I think it's literally like, invite people over to your house for dinner, cook for them, let everyone talk about all the things they find interesting. That is where scenes come from, right? And then, like, it can grow from there. Like, eventually you can turn it into events. Eventually you can call it a salon, but, like, and then go, bigger and bigger and bigger. And then suddenly it's like way beyond you. But if you want to plant a seed, that's the best way I know how. I'd be curious about, or just to interrupt, I'd really be curious about your take on this, though, because I've been a longtime reader, of your work, and you've thought a lot about community building, and how to sort of, like, spark movement and change, both in individuals and in groups. And so I'd really love to hear what your sort of thoughts on this.
Yeah, I think I mean, it's still, I'm still figuring out what I think, right, over the years. But, like, I think we are quite aligned. I think if you study historical scenes, it's always a bunch of people hanging out, right? So, like, and when you go looking for, so, like, you're saying host dinners, like, when you go looking for the dinners, it's so apparent. Like, Max Planck used to host Einstein and friends at their house parties.
Exactly.
There was, like, Martin Scorsese's mom, Catherine. She would like, again, she's never gonna be in, like, she does not. I don't think she has a Hollywood star in the Walk of Fame or whatever. But, like, she probably is one of the more important, because she was bringing everyone else together, right? And there's always, like, in the guy who brought, like, reggae from Jamaica to the rest of the world. Like, he's this very shy, reclusive guy, but he can't remember his name, Trevor Blackwell or something like that. He founded Island Records with, like, $5,000 of his parents' money, and he would just invite people around, and it's just that social intercourse, right? And I think the issue is often that it looks very trivial at the start. So it's like
Yeah.
choosing to take
Yeah.
trivial things very seriously for a very long
Yeah.
time. It's hard to justify, like, like, so locally, when I am like grumbling with my friends about the state of our art scene and so on, it's like
Uh-huh.
Singapore can totally afford, like, so, and my go-to example is always like Comedy Cellar in New York. Like, so that was just some
Sure. Yeah,
grumpy
yeah,
guy
yeah.
who had very high standards for what he thought was good
Yeah.
comedy, and he would
Uh-huh.
chase away people that he felt were not, like, he was doing things that don't make business sense, right? Like, he's just very, very passionate about
Yeah.
comedy and very persistent that he's going to dedicate like his whole life to it. And it takes like 20 years for it to really bear fruit. And like in Singapore, for example, we have the resources, like financially, but like we don't seem to have the conviction to be like, oh, we will let this arts venue kind of just be itself for 20 years. Like, we're more like, oh, 7 years, it hasn't demonstrated any grand fruit. Like, let's replace it with the next hot new thing. I'm like, each time you do that, like, it's things like people go to like some ballroom venue where there are live bands and they have their wedding there because they saw the band there 15 years ago, right? It's that kind of cultural density that it really takes. That is the hardest thing to copy about whether it's Silicon Valley or any scene, like the cluster of people and heritage and history. That seems to be the hardest thing to get going, keep going, and not kill. The shocking thing is how easily things get killed. And often with good intentions, right? It's like I was reading about MIT Building 41, which I think was familiar with it. It's like this janky ass building that people felt very comfortable breaking and putting like wires through the walls and stuff, and that allowed them to do stuff. And then people were like, oh, this is going great. Let's move them to a new shiny building. Right. So it's there's an
No,
importance
I think
of, like,
that's absolutely true. Yeah. No, I love that. I love that. That reminds me of two things. One is to make this really literal, like if you want to start like spinning up these, if you want to start hosting those dinners, I have two things I've learned that have worked really well for like making for improving the quality of time spent for people who attend the dinner. Oh. So the first is we, like, me and my wife try to bring our friends together in this kind of a way every so often, and we do like a sort of like an annual, almost like camping trip that we organize for a group that's sort of in this vein. And one thing that I do that I think everyone would have fun with, and that your guests will really appreciate, and I think it'll help level things up, is I spend a totally unreasonable amount of care and attention and time on the invite. So like I write, like this was literally like an email just to people I already know. It's not like I'm pitching something. It's like people I know. But I wrote the invite as if it were like an essay, right? Like trying to be like, how is this thing that we're coming together for, what is like the best version of it, and how can I like try to communicate that so that people come with the enthusiasm that is contagious from the invite, right? And I feel like it's so easy to just send an invite that's like, come to dinner, right? Yeah, right. Like, and so that's the normal way in which people are primed to receive invites. So like they're not going to judge you for just saying that, right? But it's a wonderful surprise when someone takes a form that is normally sort of commoditized and then like makes it ridiculous, right? So highly recommend that. It's really fun. Nice. The other thing that I've learned, okay, so maybe 5 years ago, I was a speaker at a conference in Colorado at the University of Colorado. And they had it's like the Conference on World Affairs. They have like all of these different speakers on panels and stuff. And we were in this, like I was on this panel, we were in this underground theater. It was like part of the theater department. So black walls, like it was like actually like a stage. So like black walls, completely underground, sort of stadium seating, but a small group. It wasn't like one of their big fancy panels. This was like just, I don't even remember what the topic was. But two of the other speakers on the panel were professional oral storytellers. They literally go around the world to like big events and stuff like that, and it's like being a spoken word poet, right? Like they go and they perform stories. So think of it like a stand-up comedian, but not always funny, not always jokes, right? You have drama as well as comedy, and so the panelist, the moderator of the panel asked the first question, and thankfully he asked the first question of one of those two like storytellers. And instead of answering that question directly, right? So instead of giving the intellectual answer to the question that was asked, the storyteller instead just told a story that was on theme with the question that was asked. And I had just spent days being on all these different panels, and you suddenly saw the audience light up. Like it was a totally different experience. And then it was like ping pong. The minute someone started with that, that was the only way you could answer a question, right? So it was like, then we started bouncing off each other. And by the end of this panel, it was a small audience, but it was like, I've never seen people react in that way. So much emotion in the room, so much like, depth of feeling. And afterwards, people just like mobbing everyone and talking to each other. It was so dramatic and striking. And ever since, and I fail at this constantly because I'm like a totally overly conceptual person, but whenever I'm like, like doing a speaking event or like, I don't know, being interviewed on a podcast or something, I always try to think about that. I always try to think, hey, if they're asking a question, what is the best story I can offer that illuminates something about the question rather than just trying to go straight for the answer? And so I was really delighted to receive an email from Craig Maude, who's a writer based in Japan, an American based in Japan, amazing writer. He's actually written lovely essays about cities. And so I think, he's a great one to look up if you're unfamiliar with his writing. But he started doing these walking tours where he would bring 10 people on a walking tour and then host a dinner at night. And the way that he hosted those dinners was by saying, the theme for tonight's dinner is friendship. Every participant in the dinner come with a story, a personal story about friendship. It can be 2 minutes long. It doesn't have to like be a big deal, but like we're going to start the discussion by like everyone sharing their story about friendship and then go from there. And I think that that's a really beautiful way to like kick things off if you're trying to plant a seed for a scene, because you allow people to connect and light each other up in a new way that'll be a different vibe than just when you're like grabbing takeout.
Nice. Actually, this is making me think it would be nice to ask everyone who is here who wants to participate, like what brought you to this particular salon, and like what so the idea is about cities, right? Like, so do you have thoughts or questions or something on your mind about, like what brought you here? Basically, I'm curious to hear from people. Shahid, I'm gonna arrow you because I recognize you.
Hey man, hey everyone. I can't think of a specific question. It's more just cities and communities are topics I've been vaguely interested in for a while. I believe.
I know that you've been to a lot of cities, right? You used to be like, you work near me, and then you were in Austin, and then you've been like all around.
Yeah, so I mean, I've been fortunate to like live/visit many cities throughout my lifetime, and like my intuition is that the future consists of like many kind of like cities, almost city states spread out throughout the world, each with a different flavor, each catering to a different type of person, with like fairly free movement between them. And I think something about cities allows for density, allows for variety, allows for diversity. in a way that lets the human spirit flourish. Vague thoughts, just sort of a vague interest around this topic. No specific questions for either of you guys yet for now, but that might change soon. So yeah,
I guess
thanks for having me.
What jumped out for me
Go
from
ahead.
what you said was, sorry, what you gonna say to me? I was just gonna say it's interesting that, so you brought up like flourishing, and like it does seem that something about the density of opportunity and all the, whether it's like economic stuff and social stuff and whatever, it's like having options makes it easier for people to flourish along the dimensions that they want to flourish, I think. As opposed, like, so if you want to play in like an obscure kind of band, like you have to do it in a big city where there's an audience for it, and like in a small city that's not as likely. And yeah, that's just cool.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, just a quick response. I strongly believe in that. What you just said, Visa, that like having the density and optionality allows for flourishing. There is a counter argument, I think, which some people might say, which is like too much optionality leads to like a sort of paralysis and leads to a sort of a sense of feeling lost. I've heard people like vocalize that. That's not how I feel, but I just wanted to put that out on the table as well. Go ahead, Eliot.
Yeah, it seems like, I think that's definitely true as well. And it's like, it's a city survival skill that people have to cultivate, right? Like, so like we no longer have to worry about like running and hiding from giant beasts, but we have to worry about like the psychological challenges of too many choices. And it's a different kind of challenge, but yeah. Amin, any thoughts, questions?
So I think
I just want to jump in with
Go ahead.
Oh, just to close that out, I want to jump in with a reading recommendation, which is Malka Older has this wonderful novel called Infomocracy. And what made me think about it, Shahid, was your comment about sort of like city-states and freedom of movement between them, which like right now is very limited and very unevenly distributed, right? Some people have much more freedom of movement than others. But the lovely thing about this novel is it takes place sort of in the near future, and Malka is a governance researcher, so she has like a lot of in-depth knowledge on like policy and like that kind of stuff. And she's invented this world where the physical world and sort of the political world operates almost like Reddit does on the internet, where you have different, like your citizenship is like opt-in, and you can switch, almost like you would like switch to a different sub on Reddit. And so you can sort of switch your allegiances, and then in almost every city in the world, there are like neighborhoods for each of those like subs. And it's just a really well-developed, like a deeply thought out, like reimagining of like civic institutions and what it would be like to live in them. And so, you just made me think of that book, because it was just like, it really helped me like reframe like, oh, wow, so much of what we're used to is contingent, right? It's like we could reinvent the social infrastructure around this. Like that's just as malleable as the bridge. Anyway, for what it's worth.
Yeah, nice. Amin, you're gonna go next.
So responding to the question of what brought us here to this salon, talking about the future of cities. One of the things that I've noticed a lot is, and I don't know if it's as true everywhere else, but at least in the US, the good parts of cities and the good cities to live in are old. Like I live in Boston, and I live in the older core of Boston. Boston has newer parts, they're worse to live in, less vibrant, less going on. They just feel kind of soulless and dead. I grew up in Dallas, which is a much newer city and has, despite being significantly larger than Boston, almost the size of the state of Massachusetts as a whole, it's devoid of really anything interesting going on. That doesn't make sense. Things we built in the 1920s should not be better than things we're building in the 2020s. I think we made a lot of mistakes in the 20th century, which are a different point, but I think thinking about the future of cities, of how do we correct those mistakes and how do we as a society that's forgotten how to build good cities, how do we refigure that out, and what do new cities for the 21st century and beyond actually look like? Is a lot of I think what I think about and what brought me here.
Visa, as a living in Singapore, how, because when was the largest parts of modern Singapore, when were they built out? I mean, it was in the past 30 years, right?
Yes. Yeah. So I mean, Singapore's history is interesting because like we are almost renegotiating it in real time. But if we talk about like the built environment, some of it was actually pretty early on, like the city center area, like all the city hall kind of like government institution buildings. That actually goes all the way back to like the 1920s. But if you talk about like the housing that was built, like there's a major like very rapid boom like in the post-war like 70s ish, 60s, 70s. There's this massive growth phase where probably like most of the housing development happened. And yeah, it feels like a lot. it just keeps. So I mean, it's funny because I hear from people like, so people in SF, for example, who are like complaining that oh, you know, we haven't, like, I think there's like a bus lane or something that took a really long time. And I'm like, oh, like, yeah, if you live in Singapore, one of the things you take for granted is like every couple of years you just find out there's a new train line. Like, oh, we have a new train line now. Like that's just it's to be expected. Like those things just keep happening. But yeah, I mean, to answer like when was it mostly built, I would say 60s, 70s ish. But like it's a complex question.
I think it's interesting because in the US, at least, I think the same thing is true. Kind of like most of the cities were also built in the late 20th century, but not the city core. I think we grew outwards in the US into suburbs and exurbs past that. I think a lot of the, at least on the East Coast, and I think on a lot of West Coast cities as well, it's that the urban core is very old and there's very little development, maybe some very new development, but not a long history of construction from the 60s forward. And so, yeah, anyways, the differences there are interesting.
It's also, I mean, just thinking, this is like very US centric, but like on the West Coast here in California, like a lot, like the urban development like coincided precisely with like the expansion of cars, right? So it's like a lot like what is like among urban planners, like LA became this like model, how the newer places feeling soulless. At least to me, that those seem highly correlated, right? That like we have these like a lot of these sort of expansive sprawl where you have to drive to get anywhere, and so it really doesn't lend itself to the kind of like intermixing and mingling and sort of that a lot of the best cities have. I mean, I just find this interesting because like I spent time living in Taiwan, and when I was in newer cities there, they did not have the same vibe that you're describing, but in the US, I feel that absolutely, right? And so I wonder if it's almost about what the, you know, is the city designed for humans, or is it designed for cars or something else? And maybe that also is a contributing factor.
Yeah. And it's interesting to me. I remember this from there's a subreddit called Fuck Cars, right? It's very, and it's like 400,000 plus people on it, and it's just interesting to me that I think there's several things like this where people's interest in the possibility of coordinating agreement or like shared consensus on certain ideas that did not seem as possible, I would say, even like 15 years ago, probably before the smartphone, I'm guessing. Like it seems like there was a time where urban planning or like caring about cities was something like for a small handful of specialists, and maybe like like every building or some might have someone who's like kind of passionate and they go to the meetings or they go to the city council things or whatever. But like most people don't really have the time and energy to do that. But now I guess that everyone has a phone and a voice, and like they can promote ideas. I do feel like, anti-car sentiment or just more greening or like all of these kind of things that like it's difficult for a working adult who's taking care of the family and stuff to like make that like their personal crusade. But like if everyone can just support like the one guy who's doing it in their particular borough or city or whatever, like that seems more plausible. There's a comment. Greg asks, would love to hear Eliot's take on how these urban trends and design choices relate to ruggedizing in response to escalating climate change impacts. Urban trends and design trends. Do you get it? Do you understand the question?
I think this is about like basically climate adaptation. So, so one interesting example of this, I was in my dad's Dutch, and so I was visiting family in Amsterdam a couple of years ago. I guess when was it? Was it the summer of 2019, I believe? And now this happens every year, but that year they also it was hotter than it had ever been in Amsterdam. And I remember one thing that was really striking is we were walking around the street and I noticed that they had at every bridge across the canals, because there are so many canals in Amsterdam, right? They had the fire departments out at every bridge. They were spraying water onto the pavement of the bridges because the asphalt was melting. The asphalt had not been rated for that like hot temperature. And I guess like when you have a bridge, it gets hotter than a road even because it's like separate, it's just like standing alone. And so I think, and then like that same week, I remember being in a public bus and the public bus had no air conditioning. And I don't know how hot it was inside there, but like, I'm like a healthy person in my 30s. Like if one of my elderly relatives was in that bus, I'm pretty sure they would have died. Like it was so intense. And I think that there's a lot going on. Like another equivalent is here in the Bay Area, houses don't have air conditioning because historically you've always had just enough breezes from the ocean that you'd never need it. And now during summertime, now all new construction has air conditioning here. So I do think that there are a lot of the climate change is a forcing function for changing a lot of like civic infrastructure around the world, right? Like this is true everywhere. And I think that that's going to be, that's obviously like a very big deal if you're an urban planner. I also wonder whether there are like weird and sneaky ways to like take advantage, like do things for recreation or for positive reasons there rather than just as a mitigation strategy. Like one of the lovely things that our city did during COVID is they like many streets, they just like blocked off to traffic. So you could, if you lived on that street, you could go park at home, but there was no through traffic. And so they were just pedestrian only. And like, I just don't like, they should never have changed that. Like there was no reason, it's not like everyone else was overwhelmed with traffic, but basically like once they lifted COVID restrictions, they also lifted that change. But like during that window, the city was so much more vibrant because you'd have like people just walking along these neighborhood streets and it turned them into these boulevards, right? That now they've so that wasn't expensive to do. Right, that literally required like putting some cones out. I mean, you could do it much more elegantly, but like there are all these ways which you can sort of tweak things to I feel like run these experiments in parallel and like see what's working. And I think that so there are opportunities to both or requirements to adapt to a changing climate, but also opportunities to like make our cities more livable in a positive way as well.
Yeah, I love your point that it doesn't cost much. Like it's like you could put some cones out, right? Like how many solutions are in the sphere of you could put some cones out, right? So even like I was saying earlier with like Singapore's art scenes and stuff. Like it's not for lack of money or cash. Like it's like imagination and courage and like a willingness to try something, willingness to be a bit silly maybe. And like it goes all the way down to the smaller scales of like a house party all the way up to like, how it's like a fractal similarity. And so I think definitely
I also think that there's like, I am very guilty of this. Like in many ways, like Victory Condition is an example of how guilty I am of this. But a lot of people who like are trying to think about how to change cities for the better or what could be better about cities, I feel like there's an inclination towards utopian thinking where you're like, if only everything worked, everything would be better, right? But like that's not how cities actually are. Like one of my favorite things about visiting a city like Rome or cities in the Middle East, where you just have like a lot of like deep history that like humans have inhabited this square mile for thousands and thousands and thousands of years, is like, I don't know, like I remember going into Rome, and of course you can go see the Colosseum and like the big, like the historical things, which are amazing. But my favorite part was you go to some like weird dingy coffee shop, or you get a slice of pizza somewhere, and then you need to use the bathroom, and so you go into the bathroom and it's the size of a closet, and like one wall is vinyl, but like the other wall, above the toilet is like 2,000-year-old Roman construction, right? That cities are you have these geological layers almost of like of the ephemera of like humans living there. And so they're messy, right? They're messy in a way that like Victory Condition or any of these like utopian views of like, this would be such an amazing kind of city, like aren't sometimes. Like they're messy, and you're always trying to like figure out, okay, what can we do with what we have? What can we like, how can we like tweak this? It's like a tinkerer mentality that I feel like really yields often the most interesting results. Like where it's like the cones, right? Like it's like, you don't need to reinvent it. How can you just like, oh, that worked. Oh, cool. Like let's double down on that.
Yeah. There was another story I like to tell is so in Singapore, in like around the city center area-ish, a bit to the side, there's a bunch of like historic shop houses, and so there were a bunch of regulations about how you're supposed to paint them and keep them like pristine in their old heritage styles, and like nobody really cared that much about that space, right? Like it was kind of, I mean, that's my impression. I don't know what I've been meaning to write something about it because I got to go and do like some research and investigative journalism or whatever. But like, so somehow, like this not nightlife, but like this, I guess, kind of food scene emerged, and there's like tattoo shops, and there's like somehow just the vibes were right that a few different things happened in that area, and it just became lively and fun. And like a bunch of the buildings were painted with like very bold colors, and it was you walk past it and you're like, oh, something cool is happening here. You don't even know what's happening, but you're like, it looks cool. And they almost we had this thing called the Urban Redevelopment Authority, and the URA, they almost shut the whole thing down. Like they almost insisted that everyone repaint the buildings back to code, which would have been like, the good news is that didn't happen. Like a bunch of us made some noise, and I want to believe that our noise helped, but I mean, whatever, it didn't. They didn't do the bad thing. But like, I wonder how many things are like that where even just don't kill the interesting thing that's happening. Is like, because from the bureaucrat's point of view, it's like, oh, these buildings are not being painted in the way that historically they were supposed to. But like, you have to get the community, I guess maybe journalists or artists, like somebody has to point at it and say, hey, like what are we doing here, and like what do we actually want? And like there are all these questions you have to ask, right? Like what is the point of heritage codes or whatever? Like, is it, I mean, I guess it is something that a population has to contend with itself. Like, do you want your buildings to be preserved in like a museum quality where it's like, yeah, school children come and see and be like, oh, this is how the buildings were painted 500 years ago, but like 200 years ago, not even 500, it's like 200 years, but like the people there 200 years ago showed up from on boats from elsewhere, and they just built whatever they wanted, however they wanted it. Like they weren't trying to do a museum thing. They were just doing what was convenient for them, right? And yeah, there's this kind of like, so even with, like you mentioned the Colosseum earlier, it's like there's this question of like, should it be like maintained in its current condition? Should like part of it be restored? Should part of it be like, rebuilt even potentially? Like, it's like, if you ask me personally, I feel like if it were up to me and I were like, I got to decide, I would conserve like maybe 10% of it to look like it looks now, and then like I would like, I don't know, I would encourage people to consider reworking the thing. I mean, I think a conversation, so it shouldn't be like one guy decides and then gets it done, because that's just, like fashion, like imposing one person's order on it. But I guess people should just, I would like to see people discuss more how malleable things could be. And the point isn't necessarily we should change everything, but like, I guess it's an interesting tension, because earlier on you were saying about how things are malleable, and then later on there's this like, but you don't want to be utopian-y and like bulldoze everything and build one shiny, like a very post, like no, high modernist, I don't know what's the word, like there's this very gleaming,
the current fad.
yeah.
Yeah, I think that Tokyo and San Francisco present a very interesting juxtaposition for this question, because they're on opposite sides of the Pacific. They're both like important centers within their home countries, and in Tokyo, there are very open building codes where basically, if you want to develop or redevelop an area, actually, redevelop is even more important there. It's relatively easy to do so by like global building code standards, right? Like and so as a result, Tokyo is always metamorphizing, right? It's always in mid-transformation. And San Francisco, ironically, even though it's like a pretty new city, like it's not like it's been around that long, has like, at the moment, has some very extreme building codes where, there have been like examples that people love to make fun of on the internet, where it's like, there's a laundromat a closed laundromat from the 1980s that is considered a historical building, so you can't then replace it with something that people would actually use, and so there's these, it's this funny juxtaposition, and I think that at least coming from San Francisco, the grass is always greener, right? And I look at Tokyo and I'm like, oh my God, like, can we please bring some of that thinking here? Because we just like don't have enough places for people to live. We're not like allowing the city to evolve with saving 10% of the thing or 50% of the thing or whatever. Like, I think that a lot of what it's easy to forget if you are like spending all your time thinking about things like building codes and the laws around cities, is that they are not static. Like cities, you can't preserve them in amber. Like they're a living thing, just like we are. And so if you try and like, that doesn't mean you can't celebrate one part of the living thing that remains important for new reasons, right? Like, and in some sense, maybe like having a place where school children can go to like see how things used to be, like that's not necessarily a bad thing, right? But what you have to acknowledge is the reason it's not important in itself. It's important because you're serving the school children of today, right? Like that's what makes it important. And so I think that at least living where I do, we definitely need to remember that like those building codes are themselves technology, right? That can be reinvented, right? Where you're like, okay, cool. That building code was important for a while. And like now it needs an update because like the world has changed and our city needs to change with it. And I do think that there is a way that, sometimes I think that it's very easy to sort of treat laws and codes as static when they're not, right? They're just social inventions, and we need to remember that.
Yeah, it's just a bunch of stuff people came up with at some point, and then like everything is malleable, right? Including like our beliefs and our laws and how we think about what can change and what cannot change. Yeah, anybody else have any questions? I feel like we can kind of improvise, and like we've covered.
Yeah.
What have we not covered? Like, is there anything that we want to make sure that we cover that we haven't covered? I'm gonna look at the Salon text. Essence of cities. How do cities change? What can individuals contribute to revitalization? What movements and ideas constitute the futurism of today and the past? I guess, Eliot, what are you most excited about? Like when it comes to cities and futurism, and like what like gets you going?
I mean, I think that what gets me going is something we've already touched on, but it's that tinkering, right? It's like people actually trying stuff. I think that there's like, especially when it comes to sort of like government level stuff, there's a tendency to wax philosophical and play armchair sort of policymaker, where you're like, if only people implemented my idea, things would be great. And I'm much more interested in the putting the orange cones on the bottom of the block, right? Like how can you like actually like turn the world into a playground for ideas where they're embodied, rather than simply debating like the value of an idea at the conceptual level. And so what I try to do is like seek out those tinkerers, right? And I think that this is, I think if I remember from the sort of the tweet you put out that was about questions for this session, someone said, there was something riffing on like William Gibson's line, "The future has already arrived, but it isn't evenly distributed," right? And I think that's like very true when it comes to our urban lives, right? And so what I like to do personally is seek out those people who are just like literally running experiments, and it sounds like they probably have a lot in common with the friends you were describing in SF or something, right? Like, okay, like what can we actually do? And I think that like that's actually like a symptom or a side effect, or no, I guess it's causal of all new things. Like even if you want to think beyond cities, right? Like there are people tinkering with cities, but like it's that same mentality that people are tinkering with, like, quantum fields and poetry, right? Like whatever your sort of wherever your interests lie, if you seek out the people tinkering on the fringe, that's where you're going to arrive at the unequally distributed future first, right? And so it's sort of interesting because like I write science fiction novels, so they like take place in the future, but I don't feel like I feel like I'm a naturalist. Like I feel like I'm just like finding like people I happen to find fascinating and like just paying a lot of attention, and then just like writing about basically what I see, like riffing on what I see, rather than like inventing something from whole cloth. And so I feel like if you are interested in the future of cities, wherever you live, I think that finding that fringe will be really inspirational, right? It's going to give you ideas that we aren't going to come up with here today, right? Where, and I also think that what you said before of like becoming the glue, right? Like starting your scene, like not just attending the dinners, but starting to host some, that, if you want to, like, you can help like create a new aspect of the fringe. And I think that is that's what I'm most excited about when I think about this stuff. And like, that's part of, and I'd be curious about, your thoughts on this with your essay, We Were Voyagers. But for me as a writer, part of what I sort of hope to do when I write a story like Victory Condition is sort of just like put a metaphor out there in the world that some of the right people might stumble on, right? Because like if it gives them a seed, then that they can plant, right? And I think that's like, so if you're an artist of any kind, like maybe that's part of how you contribute, right? If you're an engineer, maybe you're like literally reinventing something. But like cities are there. We often think about them because, you know, they're like the bridge in my background. Like if you're gonna write a story about a city, usually people like take a picture of infrastructure. And so infrastructure is obviously important to cities, but they are just as much social and cultural. Like they are these embodiments of everything it means to be human. So whatever your field is, you can help push that sort of frontier forward.
Yeah. So like when you mentioned, it's interesting because when you mentioned we were voyagers in the context of like this salon, like it makes me think about the other things we discussed, right? So like things are malleable, right? And tinkering, and it's sort of you could like switch, you could hot swap those phrases sort of. It's like we were
Sure.
the world, like our predecessors understood that reality was malleable. I mean, not necessarily all our predecessors, but like this is kind of like a beacon, like a calling card to everyone else who feels this way. Like there were predecessors who believed in tinkering and believed that things were malleable and believed that it was worth going out into the world in whatever sense, right? Like it's worth going out and doing things and trying things. And yeah, I think I wrote it particularly it came out all at once right after I had finished my second book. So I guess it was the thing that I was thinking about that wasn't relevant to the thing I was working on, but it was just growing and growing. So the moment I shipped the book, which was about like introspection and internal self figuring yourself out, like I immediately had this huge thing spilling out about situating yourself in history, right? So like the couple of examples I gave were like Pericles and Lincoln, who I felt were kind of doing the same thing, which was they were helping people see that their actions were meaningful in the story that they're living in, right? Like so it's like it's you weren't born, so modernity feels like you're just in the middle of nothing, or like you woke up one day like, what's going on, I'm here. And like and Nietzsche spoke about this, right? So I quoted him a bunch, where it's like you can it takes effort to figure out, and it's because your environment doesn't naturally bestow this to you. You could say that the nature of convenience and like all of those things like almost strips it away a little bit. And this also ties back to like what you were saying about putting in more effort into like doing an essay, doing an invite, right? Like writing an essay when inviting someone. It's like what I wanted to say earlier was that it reminded me of something David Ogilvy said when he used to work in a kitchen, in like a French Parisian kitchen. Like his head chef had a very strong sense of occasion. Like he would, so if like there's a VIP dining in somewhere, like he would get everyone to come and look at like the fruits of their labor through, like they'll look through the window or something. And he was just very good at getting everyone invested in the moment and feeling that their work mattered. And that's, I feel like that's also what Pericles and Lincoln were very good at doing. And it's what people are hungry for all the time. And like I think I would even say that when you write a very elaborate invite, you are creating a sense of occasion for people. You're inviting them to participate in something that feels meaningful in some way, even if it's like a very superficial, like, oh, we're just having a ball, right? A specific kind of ball, as opposed to like a non-specific kind of ball, which is still it's still something. It's still it's a story you can tell people later on, or tell yourself. You just have a good memory. And you know, like if I want to be dramatic about it, I'm like, oh, maybe you could think of cities as like clusters of memories, right? Or of like occasions of events and things happening. And like I'm always reminded of some of the things people complain about Singapore is that, oh, there's nothing to do and you go everywhere and it's boring, it's sterile, which I think there's some truth to it, and I think like it can be fixed, and I'm hoping to help fix it. And you contrast it with like New York, for example. People will say, oh, there's rats everywhere, it's terrible in a bunch of ways, but there's always stuff there's always stuff happening. Like people will tolerate the rats and the, I don't know, smells, or like people will tolerate a lot of nonsense in order to get the good thing, right? And like what you were saying about like you know, like things can be infinitely better and infinitely worse simultaneously, like, or things keep getting better and worse. And it's just I just think it's easy to forget how much possibility there is in plain sight, and how much any moment that we inhabit is a part of something bigger that we may not necessarily perceive in the moment, or in like, you have jobs to do, bills to pay, you go around your daily routine or whatever, and you forget that, oh, we are like part of this grand enterprise of humanity figuring itself out. And like when I managed, so like, I guess We Are Voyagers was an attempt to like remind myself and my friends and anyone who feels that way to kind of join in. But like, yeah, that's the excitement for me, I guess. It's like and the thing that I try to remind myself of is like, it's everything. I'm just going in circles now. I'm repeating what we said earlier. It's like, yeah, it's like we are not like a thin covering of, porn scum on a planet of like, I mean, there's one way you can look at it if you want, but like, we are a part of the goings on of the universe, right? Like just in the history, like every person's, there's a lot of layers you can approach this from. I'm reminded also of Lewis Thomas, who's like a biologist. He had a quote that like, we are all participating in this massive I'm remixing it, but it's like this massive multiplayer game of language. And like, no one person feels like, oh, I am co-authoring language itself. But we are. Every person is, by existing and talking with people and using inflections and word choices, like we are all co-authoring language. Some of us more than others by being deliberate in our writing and speech or whatever. But like, and similarly, like as citizens, like we are all shaping our cities. And it's just very exciting to realize that you can contribute and you can participate and not feel like you're in a styrofoam box just being kind of shuttled around.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more. I love that, and I think that big, right? Like we live, they're huge, and that makes us very often feel small. That when you look at the place you live in, there are so many aspects to it that just feel so beyond the scope of you as an individual human. And so it's easy to forget that everything you're looking at started small, right? Like it's like very, very easy to forget that. And so almost all significant change in history started with like a shockingly small group of people. Like we have enough people on this Zoom call right now, to spark that kind of change. Like you don't need movements of thousands. It's usually usually it emerges from the number of people who could conceivably eat a meal together. And I think that there's another sort of interesting aspect of that change, I guess, like from the invite to this conversation, the aspect of like, what does it mean for an individual to contribute to revitalization? Well, you mentioned New York City, and probably like the single individual who has sort of shaped the physical infrastructure of New York City in the past 100 years the most is Robert Moses, who is there's a book called The Power Broker, which is like a famous book about basically politics and how you get things, how this one guy got things done. It's an amazing biography. But like one really interesting aspect of that book is simply that Robert Moses was the parks commissioner. Like he basically acted like the book's title, a power broker, but his power was not based in the authority of the seat in which he sat, right? What made him powerful was not that he was parks commissioner. He did all these things that went way beyond what any parks commissioner anywhere has ever done. And he did it simply because he had these really strong convictions, and he was very ruthless about just trying to make sure they got done. So whatever strings he needed to pull, whatever friendships he needed to tap, whatever threats he needed to make, he would go do that. So I'm not saying to use him as a model for life, but I do think that it is valuable to remember that you don't need to be mayor to reinvent your city. Right? Like you don't, like that is not, like that could be a path to doing so, right? If you're interested in local politics, but that you can attack it from any angle, that you both don't need it to feel big. Like big happens later once it's working, and that you don't need to do it from a position of authority or from a place where you have like enormous amounts of resources. Like that's often not where these things start. That's where they end. So I was trying to remind myself of that.
Yeah. It's that's true. I feel it. It's Ian, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, my thoughts are still very, I think I agree with a lot of what's being said. My thoughts are still very San Francisco centric. I do live in San Francisco. And we're talking about all this, and San Francisco is like the final boss of like malleable worldview, right? Like, as I alluded to, I grew up in Malaysia. I've lived in like Malaysia, Singapore, Chicago, and now I live in San Francisco. And every time, I love it here. I do love it here. But every time I go back to other places that I've lived, I get this sort of like playground feeling. Like even Chicago is not a small city, and it is a US city. But when I walk around Chicago, like there's tons of new development. If you've sort of been there recently, right? They've transformed like the whole downtown of the city around the waterfront, made it really beautiful. So every time I go back every couple of years, I'm like, wow, look at this new thing, look at this new thing. In San Francisco, it has been absolutely the same, right? Like the whole time that I sort of lived here, the built environment is like an immovable object, right? And yes, people here start, they're like, oh, there's all these like tech companies coming out of here. But I almost feel like even if people here are very interesting and they want to start things, it's all like in their minds. It's all like in software. It's in like the words that they write or so on. And you live here long enough and you feel like, okay, your physical environment is like completely immutable. Like there's only like a very, very small number of people I know who have like opened anything like physical, any sort of like physical space here. Like it's like a dance studio or like a co-working space or whatever. And those feel super special, right? Because like that's an actual space that people can go and hang out in. And otherwise, that seems very, very rare. So I don't know, apologies for bringing like more very area specific thoughts into it. But Eliot, you live here and you were talking about like, people who are trying to do stuff. I'm just wondering, do you have any examples of when you think of people locally who are trying to do things, making those sort of small changes at the fringes? What comes to mind, especially like in the physical space?
Yeah. So the first thing I can say is, geez, I mean, I wish I couldn't identify with you as much as I do. It's like, it drives me crazy how immutable it feels here. I sometimes feel like we need to organize like the equivalent of a study abroad program of like people from San Francisco to like go to places where things actually change so that you can sort of like know how that feels. So a couple of examples. One is West Oakland. There's actually some really bunch of big warehouses have been converted to big art studios and even like a climbing gym. But probably my favorite local example in the Bay Area of people reimagining the built environment is, Ian, there we go, that Emeryville. So I live right on the border of Oakland and Emeryville, and it is super striking because when I walk my dog, I walk from Oakland through Emeryville, and Emeryville, it feels like you're in a different, like you're literally in a different country sometimes. They've really, like we talk about putting cones out on a block. There's a road that they converted the entire thing to be a pedestrian mall with like beautiful trees and really wonderful developments along it. So I think that Emeryville is the best local example on a larger scale where the government has basically actually allowed new development. And I hope that becomes a model for the rest of the Bay Area. Ironically, like that sort of emerged. I mean, I don't know how much you know about the history of Emeryville, but like it used to be like the most corrupt local government in the Bay Area. It was basically like a big train station, and there, the police were super corrupt. It was like this disaster in the mid 20th century. And so its sort of reinvention has been very dramatic over the past couple decades. And I think that's the best like scaled local example I can point to, beyond just like a friend opening a brewery or something like that.
Oh, interesting. Anybody else who hasn't said anything wants to ask a question or leave a comment? I saw Shahid had some. In the comments, we have, what are people's thoughts on the role of competent governance in a city's flourishing? And I guess we just talked about that, right? Like it seems necessary, right? And I guess the question is how, if you don't have it, what can you do to try and influence it for the better? Which feels like a lot. I don't know. I have friends in, I remember being quite heartbroken when there's some stuff going on in Nigeria, like last year or like 2 years ago, where there's like some terrible corruption stuff, and like I would have friends that I know from Twitter, and like they would be so despondent about their lack of hope for things getting better, and it's just so painful to see. And it's like, on one hand, and like their identities are tied up in their cities and hometowns and stuff, and like on one hand, you want to encourage your friends to like get out of a shitty place and go somewhere with opportunity and safety and all those things. And on the other hand, it's like, well, if the best people leave their cities, then it's gonna get worse. And it's like, it's each person has to decide for themselves, I guess, what they want to do. And it's yeah, I don't know. There's no easy answer to these things, and it's can get very sad, I think. Like, and it plays out at smaller scales as well, right? Like just people trying to figure out where their loyalty, or even the word loyalty doesn't seem quite right. Like just a city is something that you if you live there a long enough time, like your heart is a part of it, I think. That maybe I'm very sentimental, but like I've always felt that way. Elliot, what do you think about like identity and place?
Yeah. Well, I guess, okay, so two things. I mean, identity and place, like I live where I grew up, and I've lived many other places in the world, but it definitely, like feeling that you have roots somewhere is a powerful feeling. There's a reason why people often stick around, right? It's one thing that's sort of interesting for me is my family is like shotgun to all over the world. Like my mom's Canadian, my dad's Dutch, everyone's everywhere. My wife is Colombian, and her extended family is all in Cali, which is a large city in southern Colombia. And so whenever we visit, it's like her family sees each other basically at least weekly, right there, and it'll be like however many extended cousins, and that is much more normal for like humans living in community than like my weird experience of growing up, where like the first, like outside of my immediate family, like the closest blood relative I had was like 2,000 miles away. And so I think that there's that's and I think the US is unusual in that there are a lot more people like me than in most places in the world. But I do think that like in many cities, like families are their constituents, and then individuals are the constituents of families. And so like part of, like I can see what like living embedded in that is a very powerful pull, right? I was giving the example of that Infomocracy, that book that sort of imagines what if the physical world was more like the internet, but like in many ways the physical world is very unlike the internet. And Ian was sort of alluding to how people who are really used to thinking in software metaphors maybe aren't paying enough attention to how the physical world we inhabit is actually works really differently. And like one of the ways that it works differently is that if you leave a place and like you have your embedded network there, like you're giving that up, like that's gone. Like you don't get to like keep it and be elsewhere. So I think that's a really tough one, and I don't have any answers there. I think it's just important to like acknowledge that, and also that like people's lived experience of those networks is really different from each other. Like just again, for me and my wife, we like feel that very personally and intimately in our lives. I think that like on the governance question, I think that's so hard, right? No one's going to have a good answer for that. But I think that I mentioned Robert Caro, the biographer of Robert Moses, who sort of reworked New York City. The other biography that Robert Caro has been working on for most of his life now is a series of books about Lyndon B. Johnson, who was, became president, but before that sort of like worked his way up from being super poor in West Texas to then playing a pivotal role in Congress and that sort of like how he got into power. And he wound up being responsible for many of like the big legislative changes that happened in the mid 20th century, including, the Civil Rights Act and some just really important laws that changed how sort of US governance worked. And the thing that I find interesting about Lyndon B. Johnson's rise as it relates to the question of like, what if you're in a place where there's really shitty governance, is that before LBJ was in Congress, and like many people in the world, regardless of like the structure of your government, have felt this, there was this, like it was like the government could get nothing done, right? There was complete polarization, and everyone's working assumption was that like the government was basically in the federal government couldn't get anything done. It was just like super polarized and effectively useless. And LBJ came in and basically was monomaniacal about like counting votes and trading horses. Like it's like watching one of those like political dramas where everyone's like trading favors. He was like the Michael Jordan of that in American politics of his era. And that like unbelievable drive really allowed him to shift Congress from being a body which everyone sort of thought wasn't going anywhere to actually being able to do new things. And so I do think that it is possible to change governance, and hopefully there are people like him in some sense, like at work already, right? That maybe you can support, or maybe you become that person. But if you feel that your government is an inevitable decline, remember that nothing is inevitable.
That's true. Yeah. Yeah. It's always being like reborn. And one of the things I remember reading was at some point I just picked up a random book about the Medici banks, like from way back. And one of the random details from the start I remember was that, so now we look back and we think we talk about the Medicis as though they were so kind of like huge and influential and stuff. But while they were coming up, they did not think so highly of themselves, and their peers did not think so highly of them. It's like there were like two bigger banks before them that had failed, and like just conditions were terrible. It's like the Black Death, and just in recent memory, and like it was just very striking for me to read. I guess like when histories are well written from the context of the people who are living through it, you really see that in individual moments, everything kind of seems very in flux and very like, oh, you don't have a lot of power, and things seem hopeless or like whatever. But then when you look back over a longer period of time, you're like, oh, like that was. And even in my personal life, like day to day, I feel like I'm not getting much writing done. But then I look back over the last 3-4 years, like I published like one book in 2020, another book in 2022. It's like that's a pretty good pace actually. But I think it's very instructive to do like a recap or like an overview of how you feel, and like verify that against the actual reality of what happened. Because like I do think that our intuitions or our feelings might not be well calibrated for the cognitive environments that we're in, maybe. Like in this feels like it ties back a little bit to the thing about cities being like overwhelming with those of choice and stuff. Like there's a skill set that has to be cultivated, I think, about how are you going to manage your psychology and stay motivated, or like not be overwhelmed by possibilities, or by the sense of like progress might not seem like it's happening very quickly, but that doesn't mean it's not happening. And like when you look back 10, 20 years later, like what felt like slow progress might actually turn out to be, wow, that was actually remarkably a lot in a small amount of time. So yeah, it's just this is a reflection on, I don't really know if I have a, I think one of the striking things is you can think you are on top of it and it still surprises you, in my experience. Like you think you've thought about the nature of time and the nature of like relative accomplishments or a sense of progress, but it's like when you're in the belly of like the creative process and you feel like, oh, this book's not gonna work, or this essay is bullshit, or it's like there's nothing good here, and then you look at it the next day and like, actually it's not so bad. It's remarkable how volatile, or well, just things can change so much in terms of like perception and feeling. But then if you can get like a good vantage point from time to time, I think that's just very important. Like if you want to do anything substantial.
Yeah, I love that. And that makes me think of two things. One is that I think that like whenever you're working on something creative or important, like no one knows what they're doing, right? Like everyone's making it up as they go, but people tend to share things that make them look good. Right. And like it's not just individuals, right? It is true of individuals. And like even if you're sharing struggle, you're doing it in a way that often reflects well on you, right? That right. You came out the other end or whatever. And I think that that's true of individuals, but I also think that that's true of groups, right? Like companies, governments, like they present this sort of very robust like version of themselves. And I think that, in cities, because we're exposed to so many more people and institutions, like we are exposed to how they present themselves. And because we're surrounded by that, it's really easy. That sort of, I feel like, can amplify the feeling that that the internal feeling of like, oh my God, like, I don't know what the hell I'm doing. I'm just like making things up as I go. And it's easy to forget that like all of them also feel that all the time. It's just that they're presenting this sort of Iron Man version of themselves. So I feel like that's something I think about a lot, because I feel the same way. I mean, I like whenever you're working on any, like I feel like the act of being creative in any field is not knowing that it's going to work. Right? Like if you know something's going to work, it's like, is it even worth doing? Like I feel like that's what makes it worth doing, is you don't know that it's going to work. And that is what is like, that's that emotional place you're describing. And like, likewise, I'm also struck by basically the power of compounding. Like, my 11th novel comes out in October, and each of those, like that seems insane to say to me. Like I cannot believe, like that is like totally ridiculous. But like it's one of those things where it's like you just write it one sentence at a time. And I often get like questions from aspiring writers where they're sort of they want to think at the project level of the like I'm doing this big thing, and it's like, don't think about it as the big thing. Think about it as like the little thing that you did yesterday and you probably felt disappointed in yourself, but like 5 years from now, it like all of those things add up. Like I feel like doing really small things that feel insignificant, but doing them extremely consistently is underrated, right? It's like like if you like, they don't have to, it doesn't need to feel like a big deal. Big deal part. It's just like we were talking about with cities themselves, right? Like big happens after the fact.
Yeah, it's so and it feels so. It's slightly crazy making, I think, sometimes, and I felt this happen a few times to me, where like after feeling the truth of how small things done seriously, consistently make such a big difference, and it doesn't seem like that understanding is adequately captured or embodied in our institutions or in like wider social wider social understanding, I guess. Like, so there are individuals who get it, right? And when you get a cluster of individuals who get it, they as a cluster can punch way above their weight, right? And it does also seem that when you have individuals who get it, but you don't cluster them, that knowledge can be kind of lost or like kind of diffuse. Like you just know it to be true in some domain that you work in or whatever, but like if you're not getting some kind of feedback or some kind of like, you have a buddy who's also working on a thing and you chat with him like, oh yeah, we like the I've often thought something like, just being around other essayists just makes me write more essays. Like without any conversation, without any plotting. It's just, oh yeah, that guy published. I should, yeah. It's almost like pre-verbal. Like it's just being around. I remember whenever I would go to, so I used to play in a band, and I have friends who studied in Singapore has this music school called La Salle, and it's like this very open. It's in the middle of town-ish. And it's very open air, and like you walk past it and you can just hear someone like playing their trumpet scales or whatever, and it just goes to your mind, I should play more music, it's just by walking past it, you just kind of it wafts into your mind. And like I remember when I was in when I visited SF, at some point I was going to get drinks with some friends, so I just tweeted like, come and hang out with me. And while I was waiting for my friends to show up, there was a couple on, I think probably a first date, next to me, and they were both discussing like Stack Overflow, and like very excitedly and happily, like he was into it, and I was like, yeah, nowhere else in the world I would think like there's a couple, they're very into it. It's not like the one person is boring the other person, like they're both very into it. And little things like that, right? Like when you're in the right context, and like, so I remember when I went to SF for a conference, like every other day I would have the thought, I should start a company. Just being, and you know that there's so many people who are, it's like what you were saying earlier about like going to Hollywood or wherever. Like when you want to make movies, you go to where the people who are making movies are. And it's not just about the people who are also making the movies, but like, you will need you may need movie related legal stuff, and like the movie related lawyer will be there, right? The movie related accounting stuff, like, and you don't have to explain anything to those people because they get it. Like, oh yeah, you're making films, yeah, you need this attorney, you need this accountant. Whereas if you were in a more general city, you'd be like, oh, I'm looking for an accountant who understands the movie business, and like you might have to shop through like a dozen accountants before you find one. And like that reduced friction just makes such a big difference. I mean, I came here because I was thinking about essays and just the sense of, I feel like one of the themes throughout this whole call is a sense of like things are malleable and tinkering is good. And it's striking to me, even thinking about myself, that spending time around other people who are also aware of the idea that tinkering is good, malleable, things are malleable. Like I do find I need to be reminded of it, even though it seems in some ways kind of obvious. It's like, if you're not reminded of it in some way, I feel like, in my case at least, it starts to fade a little bit. I mean, have you experienced anything like that, or are you?
Oh my God, yes, no, absolutely. I think that, I mean, like we live in relationship, right? And so we're so much a product of our environment. But I feel like even calling it, like even saying it that way, you're a product of your environment, belies the level of agency you have over your environment, right? Like
Correct.
choosing who you hang out with, and where, whether you go to that music school every day, and you're reinforcing that in yourself. And so I couldn't agree more. I mean, I think that we give energy to each other, and I think that's where seeingness emerges from, right? Sort of with that sort of callback. I think it's really striking and super important. where do you meet the most essayists, just out of curiosity? Because, like, it's obvious that LA, if you want to make movies, you go there. If you want to write software, you go to the Bay Area. You mentioned writing more essays when you hang out with essayists. Have you found is there a place where you have encountered an unusual density of essayists?
I mean, so I know that I have a cluster of friends in New York who are, I don't know if I would say they're like serious essayists, but like they're creative enough and they write enough that like so if I could like snap my fingers and be anywhere, I would want to be with my friends in Brooklyn in New York. Like this is a cluster of like I don't know if it's the best place, but like I have like a dozen friends who I could like wake up in the morning and there's like it's like a group chat or whatever, like, hey, is anyone going to this coffee shop or whatever? And that small thing, like, is anyone in the coffee shop today? Like, I think that's enough to like comparatively. I don't know if like maybe a few months of that I might want to reorient somewhere else. But yeah. I do also have friends in Singapore. Yeah. I mean who write as well.
Yeah, that's good.
Well. Yeah. You're gonna say something?
Oh yeah, you just reminded me this idea of like hanging out around with the other essayists or filmmakers or what have you. There's a related idea from the same writer who I mentioned before, Craig Maud, where his definition of success I found really beautiful. His definition of success for creative work was how much time it enables you to spend with people you admire.
Oh, and
yeah, I thought that's so true, right? Like that's so true again across fields. Like if what you're fascinated by is genetic engineering, and you know, like your like the fact that like your work is your invitation to the coffee shop, the metaphorical coffee shop, right? And like that's what is just like it might inspire you to write a new essay, to be hanging around those people. Like the same is true of a bench scientist, the same is true of a painter. And so I think that's something I try to keep in mind for my own work. It's like, how does my writing translate into getting to spend more time with people I admire? And that's like the one of the downstream effects of finding that community of practice.
That's a very it's so interesting because like I feel like multiple times you have said things that feel similar to what I've thought before or read before and stuff, but like it's just phrased slightly differently enough to be fresh, and it's that's just always fun. I think it's like a new perspective on the same thing from a different angle. And I'm just reminded, I've been quoting the same passage from McLuhan several times recently, where he was talking about, because I used to be very self-conscious about repeating myself, but he had a quote about like I think he was comparing both Jewish and Hindu traditions, where they tell like this epic story in like religious folk tale or whatever, where you can kind of get the point in the first few bits, but like it goes in circles and continues to address the core themes or ideas from multiple angles. And there's this sense of like as you circle around an idea, you can increase the amount of depth of understanding that you have, and you get like this clearer 360 picture of the thing. And yeah, that's just a random thing that I have been reflecting on a lot recently. Like I used to feel self-conscious about like, am I writing the same things repeatedly? Am I saying the same things repeatedly? And now I'm like, yes, and that's a good thing. Like it gives me more perspective around things I care about. Greg asks, so Eliot, what is your community of practice for writing sci-fi? You want to answer that first, or you want to
Okay, I'll answer that second, but I just want to respond to something you just said, and then Greg, I will not forget your question. So there another reading recommendation. If you are this deep in this conversation with us, I have a very high level of confidence that you will enjoy this book. It's called Metazoa, and the author is a marine biologist philosopher from Australia. He's like a well-known marine biologist, and when you at least when I have read books about theory of mind, they often are they're very intellectual, right? And this book is very intellectual, but it's based in field work. So he's not talking about how the interaction of like mind and brain and like how minds work. He's not thinking about that in just a purely abstract sense. He's thinking about that like working with fish every day, and like how do mollusks think, and what does that tell us about human cognition? It's absolutely fascinating. But yes, Peter, thank you. It's in the chat. But one of the really beautiful things, and I'll mess up the metaphor, but you'll get a rough idea of it. In the beginning of the book, in the introduction, one of the things he describes is sort of the ways in which current popular theories of mind work, like people who work in philosophy and neuroscience, and how this book, Metazoa, it will change, like his goal with the book is to change how you think about consciousness, right? However, it is the way in which mind, right? Like it is like his approach to getting there is like if you are on a shrouded in fog, that you need to use your instruments, you need to sort of like approach it from different angles, you need to wait for parts of the weather to clear, you need to pay really close attention to tide, that in order to actually understand where you can come in for a landing, you need to do a lot of exploration to arrive at the destination. And I think that there are ideas like that in the world that require, like you talk about it as repetition. And I think that like in a true sense, you can never repeat yourself because you're a different person the next time you say it, right? So you are that sailboat trying to get into the coastline. And so, some ideas require that level of exploration. And having read the book, I think it is it worked. Like reading that, I cannot condense it to a tweet, but by looking at so many different parts of the sort of the animal kingdom and looking at them very granularly, very like spending thousands of hours with crabs, right? And like seeing how they respond to stimuli and stuff like that, you get a much more embodied feel for what consciousness means than if you just sit there think. And so anyway, I think that I think folks on this call would dig this book. And I found it really extraordinary. Greg, for what is my community of practice as a sci-fi writer, I feel like I have a pretty messy community of practice, and I think it's that I hang out with some writers, but I also hang out with a lot of people who like a lot of scientists and a lot of people who are like tinkerers, basically, like tinkerers with technology specifically is really related to sci-fi. And so for me, I'm doing sort of like extra work to imagine myself as a writer as also like inventing things, as being a tinkerer with technology. And I think that that's part of like what gives my books a specific flavor sometimes, is that like my community of practice is weirder, or like I hang out with like a bunch of different types of people who are all working on stuff, rather than being like very specific. Like I do have friends who are screenwriters who hang out mostly with screenwriters and filmmakers. And I think that as a sci-fi writer, I hang out both with writers and also like cis and technologists, and that's and I try to imagine myself into their world, and that's part of where the fiction comes from.
Nice. Yeah, I've always been kind of on the team of it's important. It's like it's important to do both, right? So you want to be amongst people who also care about the same thing as you do, but I also think it's very important to like be away from that. And I've
Yeah.
it's funny. I've been invited to speak several times at like several gatherings of people, and like a recurring thing I always say is like, what you have here is amazing, whether it's like a meditation place or like some kind of online writers meetup or like a few different clusters of things. And I always find myself saying like, what you have here is amazing. You should do like, you should be like proud and grateful and whatever. And I also wish all of you a very happy like get away from it from time to time, so that you can see like you gotta get like I think I have a tweet that's like, everyone's obligation should be, from time to time you have to like leave the village and go and find some interesting morsel, like read some book that none of your friends are reading, right? Watch some movie that nobody else is watching, and like share some of that with everyone else. Like, oh, like, you know, because if everyone is only reading the same books and discussing the same thing, then we all get clustered in this very narrow space and it gets stifling. Whereas like if everyone has like at least 10%, 20% of their time doing some other, and it could be as much as 80%, I don't know, whatever, as the spirit moves you, right? But like, yeah, it's a strange yin yang thing, I guess. Like you want both. You want familiarity, but also a little bit of alienness so that it's fresh.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I don't do very much of is I find that I often don't learn that much reading about writing, like, you know, writers writing books about craft, right? Like I actually find those to be, I mean, sometimes like I read them every once in a while, but I often don't find them to be particularly illuminating. Like I learn much more about craft from learning how musicians are making music, or how you know, how a mathematician is arriving at a new proof. Like I think that we underestimate how everything is interconnected. So like any field, you can draw lessons from any field and apply them to another. And I think that's absolutely true. Like it's really helpful to like read widely rather than deeply. Sometimes
so like multiple people have told me that I leave I leave good comments on things, like I just respond well to things, and I at some point someone persuaded me that I should write something about how to do it, and I can't. I tried and I can't. Like I ended up, I think I wrote an interesting-ish draft about why it's so difficult to explain, because it so much requires like a responsiveness to the thing that you're responding to. If you have some pre-existing formula for, oh, I'm gonna do this, then I'm gonna do that, then it's like you know, it's like you have to be willing to like I'm sure some general principles can be described, like, you know, look for something interesting, respond to that, whatever, but like being willing to drop everything that you think you know because something new is fresh and interesting, like that's the main thing. And I guess I bring that up just to be like, it's possible that someone can be a great writer and struggle to explain how they do it, right?
No, I couldn't agree. I mean, like that, like teaching that is not like that's a totally different skill as well, right? And no, that's a really funny thing. It is odd, and I think that it's just like I think that it's similar to travel, right? Like you can, if you spend all your time in one place, like you can obviously learn a lot about that place, but you get such a different perspective on it when you go somewhere else, right? Ian, you were talking about like going to Chicago and then, you know, coming back and forth and just seeing those differences with SF. And I feel like that's so true of any aspect of work, that it's very revealing of your own assumptions to try to, you know, get outside of your comfort zone. I do think that there's one thing you said that I think is, in some ways, I guess you could consider it a first principle here, which is like following your curiosity, like following what you find interesting, and then also like sharing that enthusiasm with others. Like I just remember, like in high school, like my best teachers, like like the subjects that I got the most, the classes I got the most from were not like, that's what made it interesting, was like the teacher's enthusiasm was contagious. And so like following other people's enthusiasm is like a great North Star, right? Like if someone's like super, if they inspire your interest, like go down the rabbit hole. Like that's where the fun is.
While you were mentioning travel,
and then try to share the view you gain with others.
While you were mentioning travel, I got reminded of one of my favorite like travel experiences / stories. So like when I was growing up as a kid, I didn't actually like travel because my experience of travel was always just being moved around with my family, and it was like my family were very much not curious travelers. Like they just go to the hotel, then go to the museum, and then I was like, and I think I internalized the sense of, well, if travel is just looking at things, I can just look at things on TV or on the internet or whatever. But then, like, the thing that blew my mind open, I remember, was when I was traveling alone with my girlfriend, who's now my wife. But like, we went to Thailand from Singapore, and we went to like it's like we're just hanging out. I guess we didn't really have a particular goal or whatever. And at some point, we went to get lunch, and Thailand has food courts just like Singapore, very similar. Like there's many different stalls and you buy your food, whatever. But like in Singapore, all of the cutlery, the forks and spoons and knives, they're all centralized. They're all at each store. So you go to the store and then you get your cutlery at the store. And in Thailand, the cutlery is centralized. And in that, I had a moment where I was like, wait, why is it? Wait, like, yeah, you could do it either way. There's no particular like. It's like some arbitrary set of conditions led to Singapore being that way, and some arbitrary, and there's probably no like cutleries it's like thus it shall be, right? Like it's just true, really butterfly wing flap kind of random chaos, and like why do you drive on what side of the road or whatever, right? It's just different, and that instantly made me interested in travel for the rest of my life in many different small little ways. But like the sense of nobody sold me travel the way I would pitch to my younger self or whatever. It's like it's not about seeing things, it's about being out of your usual nexus of relationships and assumptions and whatever, and being in a new place, and then you get to witness what things do you assume to be true that may not necessarily be, and what and it's that delta between, it's just that difference that's like, it's very refreshing in a certain way. It's not just even refreshing, I don't know if it's the right word. It's disorienting in a good way, right? Like it's like you reorient yourself, and then you come back and you're like, oh, everything is malleable, right? Like it's like including things that you never occurred to question because it's just so much a part of your default status quo. And yeah, since then I've always been like, I nowadays, if I'm going anywhere, I look out for things that I'm not sure I would have thought to look out for previously. It's a subtle, it's like payments and just how to like my wife got us a stopover in Frankfurt on the way back from New York, and so like within the span of maybe 48 hours we rode the subway in New York, and then we rode the train in Frankfurt, and then we rode the train in Singapore, and you really feel like, oh my god, like all these, like, so in Frankfurt you don't have to, like, if you wanted to be like a fare evasion cheat in Frankfurt, like it's super easy. Like you don't even have to tap anything. You go to the machine and you buy a ticket. But if you didn't buy it, like you probably would get away with it. Like it's just such a high trust thing. And like New York is slightly different, Singapore is slightly different, and it's just, you really get a sense of, oh, like the things that each person growing up in that one city would take that for granted as just the way that subways are. But like no, every subway is slightly different. It's like, and yeah, once you see that, it's never quite the same.
Yeah, my favorite thing to do when traveling is just to not, you said you went with your girlfriend and did not have a goal. And my favorite thing to do is just to show up and have no goals and just basically wander around, like literally wander around city streets for hours and days. Like I feel like that's often where the most surprising and like interesting moments happen, rather than the sort of planned itinerary kind of stuff.
You let the city happen to you in some ways.
Yeah, that's beautifully said. Yeah.
All right. I guess we can start wrapping up. If anybody want to ask any final questions or comments, thoughts, we can wait for the chat to say something. Let me think about anything else anything we haven't covered.
I have a not fully formed question or thought, so I'm just gonna start talking.
Yes.
But yeah, early on you mentioned like, oh, like why are cities important? You know, like there's probably more people who live inside of cities than out of them, and like, you know, we talked about how people who live in like Tokyo and San Francisco probably have like more in common than, you know, like San Francisco and a town like 2 hours out, right? And I think all of that is true. And it also sort of struck me like as we were here and talking, it's like, man, we are on this call, people from like all over the world, and we all like the same references, and like we know about the SF bus lane and like the power broker, and like we all, you know, and these like these things you would say are like so hyper specific, that everybody knows like what we're talking about, and like we all have like the same language and references and so on. But then we just were talking about how things are so different. Like the subways are different in New York and Frankfurt and Singapore. It sort of maybe start thinking like, okay, there's almost like two sets of norms, right? You have like your brain, maybe your brain norms and your body norms, or like your physical environment norms. And yeah, there are people like who I'm very close to here who would probably have no idea, like they wouldn't really know like what the deal is with the bus lane, like, or they don't know like who Robert Moses is or whatever. But that's kind of interesting, right? I almost feel like the internet has become like your sort of brain. The people that you talk to the internet are like they have the same brain as you, but the people who live around you have the same like physical habits, right? Like almost like same body as you, and that's a thought that I didn't really, I guess, articulate to myself before. That things are sort of diverging in that way.
I love that. It also makes me think that like if we imagine the internet as that sort of new ingredient, how things that travel easily on the internet, like information, media, that kind of stuff, are so easy to share across any city, or no matter, like regardless of geography. But things like how the subways work differently, like that is not internetable, right? Like, and so the fact that we share cultural references, all of that stuff is sort of like part of the ongoing bubbling conversation on the internet all the time, which is part of why it is shared. But the things that are not part of that conversation are the physical world, whereas like the way your subway works is inherently local. So maybe going forward, the thing that will be most interesting in traveling is actually exploring the differences in physical reality, because they're going to be the things you can't access online, right?
I'm reminded of this video of this YouTube video of this guy I think he's from Italy, and he's reviewing croissants in Paris, and he's doing it during the riots. And he's just quote unquote ignoring the riots. And it's like just this riots going on, and he's just like, oh, which croissant is eating, and it's like fire in the background. And that just felt like a very it's an interesting thing, particularly because I think it somewhat subverts it's like he's playing playing a bit of the food review blogger trope, but like also I don't know, it felt like a great piece of modern art in some ways. I'll post a link if you want to see it. Paris croissant review. Anyway, yeah. Definitely, it's not just local to like physical. It really feels it's very compelling. Like you can't help but watch it, because it just like if you start watching it, you'll be like, what's going to happen? I mean, you know that he's probably fine, and he is fine, but like there's something about the immediacy of a particular moment that felt important in some way. Yeah, Ian, I missed the first half of what you're saying, but I think you're talking about like how people are sharing brains, like sharing ideas in
Yeah, I was just saying I was struck by like how similar all of our references are, even though we live in like places all over the world on this conversation, and how different that is from we're like, okay, but there are tons of differences in our physical environments, and like, you know, my expectations of my physical environment are the same as like other people in San Francisco, and they're super different than someone who lives in a different city. But when we are not talking about our physical environment and we're talking about references and like cultural sort of pieces of knowledge, we gather in a space like this, and even though we are like all over the world, our reference points are like exactly the same. Or not exactly the same, but close enough that I thought it was remarkable.
there's definitely a clustering that happens. And it's, you know, I'm always trying to invite more people to participate because I think it's very valuable real estate. Like, it's crazy. It's like a thing that I rant about sometimes is that, like, there have been times where I'm trying to find an answer to a question online and I can't quite find it. And then so I go digging around and until I piece it together. Like, it might be I have a specific question, and to find the answer to that question, you have to go digging in a bunch of related things. And then I just combine those answers on a blog post on my, and this goes all the way back to what me and Eliot were talking about at the start about writing the books that you want to read. Even like blog posts, there's like information resources that are useful to you. Like, if it solves the problem for you, there's like thousands of other people with the same problem, and they will find your stuff through like search engines or whatever. And it's just like, I don't know if it's a specific kind of brain. Like, so even, you know, and again, it's like Eliot, you're talking about being attuned to like storytelling and folklore when everyone else is playing with stuff, right? And it's like there's something, I guess I'm getting at, like, I have often found myself in a position historically, and these days it's, when I was younger, it was a challenge because I would be trying to pitch to people around me that they should care more about things that they don't really care about, and that's a losing battle because each person has to care about what they naturally care about, I guess. But over the years, and compounding effects again, right? Like, I just kept at it because I just had to, I guess. And over the years, I have become an attractor for other people who care about the same things. And now it's very easy for me to, like, at a snap of my fingers, start a discussion with like hundreds of people around the world about anything that's interesting to us. But yeah, I'm still always trying to increase the diversity of the core curriculum or the core set of things that we check out, because again, it's nice to have a sense of kinship and community with, oh, we all read the same books or we all watch the same videos. But yeah, it would be more exciting and more again, it's like the tinkering and malleability thing again, right? It's like if each person just kind of fiddled a bit more, like the net richness of everything available to everyone is so much higher. So hopefully we'll see more of that. We'll see. I think we're already seeing it. You know, it's funny because like, so I have like that meme that's like, will we get to a golden age someday? And it's really funny because when I was trying to like piece together some writing and like notes and stuff about what things could be like, it's very difficult. It's not difficult. I mean, when you examine the combination of Wikipedia and YouTube and Twitter and like all the free resources that's available to everyone, like, you can't. I start to. It dawns on me that we might already be in it, and we just don't. We're not ecstatic about it moment to moment. But like 50 years from now or whatever, we might look back as, oh, like the great post-smartphone flourishing of information, and it doesn't feel that way because there's like chaotic and noisy and like, again, it's like, how many people living through like the golden age of Florence woke up in the morning and be like, it sure is nice to wake up in the golden age of Florence. Like, it's they might not feel it. Like, it's just in retrospect when the stories are told, it becomes that way, I think. So there is this there's a beautiful thing to end on. So like, two of my favorite books. One is and I just wrote an essay about this, but I'm going to share it with all of you guys again. One is The Hero with a Thousand Faces by Joseph Campbell, and the final paragraph ends with Campbell quoting Nietzsche saying that we should live as though the day were here. So it's like, you can't wait for your whole community to become enlightened and to shed all the resentment and frustration and whatever. You just have to conduct yourself as if it were already the case. Another book is by Rollo May, and this was like around the same. He's kind of like in the 1950s psychotherapy, not super famous, but like in that cluster of people, like amongst the people who know psychotherapy, he was one of them. And his closing book paragraph was about quoting Socrates and Glaucon. And Glaucon was saying something like, "Oh, Socrates, whether or not, there may never be a city on heaven or in earth that where like people are wise and like doing good acts and whatever." And Socrates' response was, whether or not such a city ever exists or will ever exist in earth or heaven, the wise man acts as if it were so, and in so doing puts his house in order around that. So I mean, both quotes are around this idea of like meme. It's almost like you can meme into reality the world that you would like to live in, sort of like maybe not perfectly, but like there's a sense of if you wait until the environment makes things feasible for you to do what you want, like you may be waiting forever. Whereas if you assert yourself and be like, this is what I think is a good idea, and like, well, let's see what people say or do, like there's something there about, and like again, like what Eliot was saying about like the power broker and just like the whether or not you agree with the specifics, like the underlying thing is that like you can just do stuff, and you can just, even if the traffic lights are not all green, like you can start moving and then see what happens and iterate and keep moving.
And I think the interesting thing about that is that regardless if history agrees with you, it's still the best thing to do right now, right? If you're living as if, right? Like you can't control whether 100 years from now people will call this the golden age of the post-smartphone, just like they called it the golden age of Florence or whatever. But like you don't have agency over that regardless. So like asserting yourself in history is the only way to make it, one way or the other. I think that's absolutely right.
Yeah, I think that's a very nice like closing thought. Like, so like, go forth in your own work and in your own life and tinker and meddle and happen to things, right? And have some vision for how, even if it's just a bunch of your friends, like what could you all do differently amongst yourselves? And like what house parties can you organize and what conversations could you be having? And it's like, yeah, those little things taken seriously kind of compound and add up over time. Yeah, that's my closing thought.
Love it. Well, I mean, I really appreciate the fact that this little conversation is an example of that, right?
Yeah.
Like, and hopefully this is a seed we're planting in each other. I really appreciate it. I'm coming away from it excited and with a bunch of new ideas. So thank you.
All right, I will end the call here then. Thanks everyone, and take care. And the recording will be on YouTube at some point, I think. And yeah, good night, good morning for those of you in the morning. Good night from me. And yeah, bye-bye.
Bye.